Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. While her classmates spent their weekends at the mall or gossiping about boys, Sarah was in her backyard practicing moves she learned from her older brother Miguel, who had taught her boxing and martial arts before he deployed overseas with the Marines. At 23, Sarah worked as a waitress at Danny's Diner, a popular spot near Fort Braxton Military Base. The diner was always busy, especially on Friday nights when soldiers would come in after their weekly training exercises. Sarah had been working there for 2 years, and she knew how to handle the rowdy crowds, the bad tips, and the occasional inappropriate comment. Most of the soldiers were respectful. They would order their food, joke around with their buddies, and leave decent tips. But there was one group that always made Sarah's stomach twist with dread when they walked through the door. Led by Sergeant Rick Morrison, this group of 5 soldiers seemed to think the diner was their personal playground. Sergeant Morrison was a large man, probably 6 feet 4 inches tall, with broad shoulders and arms covered in tattoos. He had been in the Army for 8 years and acted like he owned every place he entered. His crew followed him around like puppies, laughing at his crude jokes and copying his behavior. Sarah had complained to her manager, Tom, about Morrison's group multiple times. They would make loud, inappropriate comments about her appearance, call her over to their table just to waste her time, and leave messes on purpose. Worst of all, they would leave terrible tips after running her around all night. "Just ignore them," Tom would always say. "They're good customers. They spend a lot of money here." But Tom didn't have to deal with Morrison's wandering hands when she walked by their table, or his crude comments about what he'd like to do to her after her shift ended. Tom didn't have to smile and pretend everything was fine, while being humiliated in front of a restaurant full of people. The other waitresses had warned her about Morrison, too. Jenny, who had worked at the diner for 5 years, told Sarah that Morrison had gotten worse over time. "He used to just be loud and rude," Jenny explained during one of their breaks, "but lately he's been getting more aggressive. Last month, he cornered Lisa in the storage room and tried to kiss her. She had to push him away and threatened to call the police before he backed off." Sarah's friend, Rosa, who worked at the diner part-time while attending community college, had her own stories about Morrison's behavior. "He follows me to my car sometimes," Rosa confided one evening as they cleaned tables together. "Just stands there watching me get in and drive away. It's so creepy. I started asking other people to walk me out, but I shouldn't have to do that just to feel safe at my job." Despite all these incidents, Tom refused to ban Morrison and his group from the diner. The truth was that Tom was scared of confronting a table full of soldiers. He worried about causing problems with the military base, which brought in a significant portion of the diner's business. Sarah tried different strategies to deal with Morrison's group. She would ask other waitresses to take their table, but they all refused after their own bad experiences. She tried being extra professional and cold, hoping they would get bored and leave her alone. She even tried being friendly, thinking maybe they would show her more respect if she was nice. Nothing worked. Morrison seemed to enjoy making her uncomfortable. The more she tried to avoid him, the more he sought her out. He would specifically request her section when they came in. He would call the diner and ask for her by name, then hang up when she answered. He started showing up on nights when she was working alone with just one cook in the kitchen. The situation was affecting Sarah's life outside of work, too. She found herself constantly looking over her shoulder when she walked to her car. She started having trouble sleeping, always worried about what Morrison might do next. Her grades at the community college, where she was studying to become a nurse, began to suffer because she was too stressed and tired to focus on her studies. Sarah's family noticed the change in her behavior. Her mother, Maria, kept asking if everything was okay at work. Her younger sister, Carmen, said she seemed angry all the time, but Sarah didn't want to worry them or make them feel like they needed to protect her. She had always been independent and strong, and she wanted to handle this problem on her own. One Thursday evening, Sarah was working a double shift because another waitress had called in sick. The diner was relatively quiet, with just a few regular customers and one family with young children. Sarah was looking forward to going home early and getting some rest before her Friday classes. That's when Morrison walked in with three of his usual companions. They were clearly drunk, stumbling slightly and talking louder than usual. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as they seated themselves in her section, even though there were empty tables in other areas of the restaurant. "Well, well, well," Morrison called out as Sarah approached their table with menus. "If it isn't my favorite little Mexican princess." Sarah clenched her jaw but forced herself to smile professionally. "Good evening, gentlemen. Can I start you off with some drinks?" "You can start by telling me when you're going to stop playing hard to get," Morrison replied, causing his friends to laugh. "I've been asking you out for months, sweetheart. A girl like you should feel honored that a man like me is interested." Sarah ignored the comment and repeated her question about drinks. Morrison and his friends ordered beers and shots, which was concerning since they were already intoxicated. Sarah brought their drinks quickly, hoping they would finish them and leave soon. But Morrison had other plans. Every time Sarah walked by their table, he would say something inappropriate. When she brought their food, he made crude comments about her body. When she refilled their drinks, he asked explicit questions about her personal life. The other customers in the diner began to notice the harassment. The family with children looked uncomfortable and asked to move to a table farther away from Morrison's group. An elderly couple who were regular customers kept glancing over with concerned expressions. Sarah tried to stay professional, but Morrison was getting bolder as the night went on. When she brought their check, he grabbed her wrist as she set it down on the table. "I know you want me," he said, squeezing her wrist tighter. "Stop playing games and just admit it. I can show you a real good time." Sarah pulled her hand away and stepped back from the table. "Please, don't touch me," she said firmly. "I'm just trying to do my job." Morrison's friends laughed, and one of them said, "Come on, Sarge, she's not worth it. Let's go find some girls who know how to have fun." But Morrison wasn't ready to give up. He had been drinking for hours, and Sarah's rejection in front of his friends had made him angry. He stood up from the table, swaying slightly, and pointed his finger at Sarah. "You think you're too good for me?" he yelled, loud enough for everyone in the diner to hear. "You're nothing but a little waitress in a cheap diner. You should be grateful that someone like me even looks at you." Sarah felt her face flush with anger and embarrassment. Tom was in the back office doing paperwork and hadn't heard the commotion. The cook was busy in the kitchen with his headphones on. She was alone with these drunk soldiers and a few customers who were too scared to intervene. "Sir, I need you to lower your voice," Sarah said, trying to keep her own voice steady. "There are other customers trying to enjoy their meals." Morrison laughed mockingly. "Other customers? You mean these losers?" He gestured around the diner dismissively. "Nobody cares what happens in this dump." That's when Morrison picked up his nearly full glass of beer and looked Sarah directly in the eyes. For a moment, she thought he might throw it at the wall or slam it down on the table. She never expected what happened next. Without warning, Morrison threw the entire glass of cold beer directly at Sarah's face and chest. The beer soaked through her uniform and dripped onto the floor. The glass fell and shattered at her feet, sending pieces across the linoleum. The diner went completely silent. The elderly couple gasped in shock. The family with children stared in disbelief. Even Morrison's own friends looked surprised by what their sergeant had done. Sarah stood there for a moment, beer dripping from her hair and clothes, pieces of glass around her feet. She felt humiliated, angry, and completely helpless. This man had been harassing her for months, and now he had physically assaulted her in front of everyone. Something inside Sarah snapped. All the months of harassment, all the sleepless nights, all the fear and stress and humiliation came rushing to the surface. Her brother Miguel's voice echoed in her head from all those training sessions in their backyard. "If someone attacks you, You defend yourself. Period. Morrison was still laughing, pleased with himself for putting the uppity waitress in her place. He was turning back toward his friends, probably to make another crude joke, when Sarah made her move. She stepped forward quickly, planting her left foot firmly and rotating her hips the way Miguel had taught her. Her right hand formed a perfect fist, and she drove it forward with all the power she could generate from her legs, core, and shoulder. The punch connected perfectly with Morrison's jaw. Her brother had always told her that accuracy was more important than strength, and Sarah's aim was flawless. Morrison's head snapped to the side, and his knees buckled immediately. The big sergeant, who had seemed so powerful and intimidating just seconds before, crumpled to the floor like a house of cards. He was unconscious before he hit the ground, his body making a heavy thudding sound as it landed near the broken glass. The silence in the diner was deafening. Morrison's friends stared at their unconscious sergeant in complete shock. The other customers looked back and forth between Sarah and the man lying motionless on the floor. Sarah stood over Morrison's body, her fist still clenched, beer still dripping from her uniform. She felt a mixture of satisfaction, fear, and disbelief. She had never hit anyone in her life outside of practice sessions with her brother. She certainly had never knocked anyone unconscious. One of Morrison's friends knelt down beside him and checked for a pulse. "He's breathing," the soldier announced, relief evident in his voice. "But he's definitely out cold." That's when Tom finally emerged from his office, having heard the commotion. He took in the scene. His waitress standing over an unconscious soldier, broken glass scattered across the floor, and beer everywhere. "What the hell happened out here?" Tom demanded, looking around the diner in confusion. Sarah looked at her manager, then at Morrison's unconscious form. Then at all the witnesses who had seen everything. She realized her life was about to change dramatically, and she had no idea whether it would be for better or worse. The elderly couple who had been sitting near Morrison's table immediately spoke up before Tom could say anything else. "That soldier threw a beer at her," the elderly man said loudly, his voice shaking with indignation. "He's been harassing that poor girl all night long, and then he threw his drink right in her face." His wife nodded vigorously. "We saw the whole thing, Harold. That young lady was just defending herself. That man was completely out of line." The family with children also confirmed what had happened. The father stood up and addressed Tom directly. "Your waitress did nothing wrong," he said firmly. "That guy was drunk, loud, and aggressive. He assaulted her first. She had every right to protect herself." Tom looked around the diner, trying to process what everyone was telling him. Morrison was still unconscious on the floor, with one of his friends kneeling beside him and the other two looking nervous and uncertain. Sarah finally found her voice. "Tom, I can explain everything, but first we need to call an ambulance. I think I hit him pretty hard." As if on cue, Morrison began to stir. He groaned and tried to sit up, holding his jaw with one hand. His eyes were unfocused, and he looked confused about where he was. "What happened?" Morrison mumbled, wincing as he touched the side of his face. "Why am I on the floor?" One of his friends helped him stand up slowly. Morrison was clearly disoriented and unsteady on his feet. When he saw Sarah standing nearby, the events of the previous few minutes seemed to come back to him. "You hit me," he said, pointing at Sarah with obvious disbelief. "You actually hit me." Before Sarah could respond, Tom jumped in. "All right, everybody just calm down. Let's figure this out without any more violence." But Morrison wasn't interested in calming down. Despite being knocked unconscious just minutes earlier, his anger was returning quickly. The humiliation of being dropped by a small waitress in front of his subordinates was more than his ego could handle. "I'm calling the police," Morrison declared, pulling out his cell phone. "That crazy woman assaulted me. I want her arrested." The elderly couple immediately protested. "You assaulted her first," the woman called out. "We all saw you throw that drink at her." Morrison ignored them and dialed 911. Within minutes, Sarah could hear sirens approaching the diner. She felt her stomach drop as she realized how serious this situation had become. Tom was clearly panicking. He had never dealt with anything like this before, and he was terrified about what it might mean for his business. He kept looking back and forth between Sarah and Morrison, as if trying to figure out which side he should support. 2 police officers entered the diner shortly after the ambulance arrived. Officer Jennifer Wells was a veteran with 15 years of experience, while Officer Mike Rodriguez was relatively new but had already developed a reputation for being thorough in his investigations. The paramedics examined Morrison first, checking his jaw and looking for signs of a concussion. They determined that while his jaw was sore and he might have a mild concussion, he didn't require immediate hospitalization. Officer Wells began interviewing witnesses while Officer Rodriguez talked to Sarah and Morrison separately. The stories they got were consistent from all the civilian witnesses, but Morrison and his friends presented a very different version of events. According to Morrison, Sarah had been rude and aggressive toward their table all evening. He claimed that he had barely touched her wrist when she exploded and attacked him without warning. His friends backed up his story, though none of them mentioned the months of harassment or the fact that Morrison had thrown beer at Sarah. Sarah told the officers the truth about everything: the months of harassment, Morrison's inappropriate behavior, him grabbing her wrist, and finally throwing the beer in her face. She explained that she had felt threatened and humiliated, and that hitting him had been a reaction to defend herself. The civilian witnesses corroborated Sarah's account completely. The elderly couple, the family with children, and even some customers who had been in the bathroom during the incident but had seen Morrison's behavior earlier in the evening all supported Sarah's version of events. Officer Wells found herself in a complicated situation. On one hand, Morrison was clearly the victim of assault. Sarah had admitted to hitting him, and he had the bruised jaw to prove it. On the other hand, multiple witnesses confirmed that Morrison had thrown a drink at Sarah first, which was also technically assault. The fact that Morrison was a soldier complicated matters further. Fort Braxton had strict policies about their personnel's conduct in the community, and any arrest could have serious consequences for Morrison's military career. After nearly 2 hours of interviews and investigation, Officer Wells made her decision. Both Sarah and Morrison would be cited for simple assault. They would have to appear in court, where a judge could determine the appropriate consequences based on all the evidence. Morrison was furious about being cited. He had expected Sarah to be arrested while he walked away as the victim. His friends tried to calm him down, but he was ranting about corrupt small-town cops and threatening to call his commanding officer. Sarah, on the other hand, felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. She was relieved that she wasn't being arrested and taken to jail, but worried about what the court case might mean for her future. She had never been in trouble with the law before, and she wasn't sure how she would afford a lawyer. After the police left, Tom sat Sarah down for a conversation that she had been dreading. "Look, Sarah," Tom began, "I know you've been having problems with that guy, and I probably should have done something about it sooner, but I can't have my employees getting into fights with customers no matter what the circumstances are." Sarah felt her heart sink. "Are you firing me?" Tom sighed heavily. "I'm suspending you without pay until this court case gets resolved. If you're convicted of assault, I'll have to let you go permanently. The diner's insurance won't cover me if I keep an employee who has a violent criminal record." The unfairness of the situation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Morrison had been harassing her and other female employees for months. He had thrown a drink at her in front of multiple witnesses, but she was the one facing unemployment and a potential criminal record. "Tom, you know this isn't fair," Sarah said, fighting back tears. "I've been a good employee for 2 years. I've never caused any problems. I was defending myself from a man who has been terrorizing me for months." Tom looked genuinely sorry, but his mind was made up. I know it's not fair, Sarah, but I have to protect the business. I'm sorry. Sarah gathered her purse and walked out of the diner, still wearing her beer-soaked uniform. She sat in her car for several minutes before driving home, trying to process everything that had happened. When Sarah arrived home, her family was waiting up for her. Her mother, Maria, had heard about the incident from a friend whose daughter had been in the diner that evening. News traveled fast in their small town. Sarah told her family the whole story, starting with months of Morrison's harassment and ending with Tom's decision to suspend her. Her mother was outraged, her father was concerned about the legal implications, and her sister Carmen was proud that Sarah had stood up for herself. "Mija, you did what you had to do," Maria said, hugging her daughter tightly. "That man had no right to treat you like that, no right at all." Sarah's father, Roberto, was more practical in his concerns. "We need to find you a lawyer, and a good one. This could affect your whole future if it's not handled properly." The next morning, Sarah discovered that news of the incident had spread throughout the community overnight. Her phone was buzzing with texts and calls from friends, classmates, and even people she barely knew. Some of the messages were supportive. Friends from high school and college reached out to tell her they were proud of her for standing up to her harasser. Several current and former female employees of the diner called to share their own stories about Morrison's behavior and to offer to testify on her behalf if needed. But other reactions were less positive. Some people in the community felt that Sarah had overreacted and that violence was never the answer. A few anonymous messages called her names and suggested that she was just looking for attention or trying to get Morrison in trouble. Most concerning were the messages that seemed to come from Morrison's friends or supporters. These messages were more threatening, suggesting that Sarah would pay for what she did and that she had messed with the wrong people. Sarah tried to focus on her college classes and finding a new job while she waited for her court date, but it was difficult to concentrate on anything else. The stress was affecting her sleep, her appetite, and her ability to study. Her search for a new job was particularly challenging. News of the incident had spread to other local businesses, and some managers were reluctant to hire someone who might come with drama or legal problems. 3 weeks after the incident, Sarah received a call that would change everything. The caller was Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes, the commanding officer of Morrison's unit at Fort Braxton. "Ms. Martinez," Lieutenant Colonel Hayes said, "I'd like to speak with you about the incident involving Sergeant Morrison. Would you be available to meet with me at the base tomorrow afternoon?" Sarah was nervous about going to the military base, but she agreed to the meeting. She had no idea what to expect or why Morrison's commanding officer wanted to speak with her. When Sarah arrived at Fort Braxton the next day, she was surprised by how professional and respectful Lieutenant Colonel Hayes was. Hayes was a woman in her early 40s with a no-nonsense demeanor, but she seemed genuinely concerned about the situation. "Ms. Martinez," Hayes began, "I've been conducting my own investigation into Sergeant Morrison's behavior, and I've learned some very disturbing information. I understand that he's been harassing you and other women for quite some time." Sarah nodded, unsure of where this conversation was heading. Hayes continued, "I want you to know that this kind of behavior is absolutely unacceptable and does not represent the values of the United States Army. I've already spoken with several other women who have come forward with complaints about Sergeant Morrison's conduct." It turned out that Hayes's investigation had uncovered a pattern of behavior that went back years. Morrison had been reported for inappropriate conduct at his previous assignment, but those reports had been buried or ignored by his previous commanders. The incident at the diner had finally brought his behavior to the attention of someone who was willing to take action. "I want to offer you my personal apology," Hayes said, "and the Army's apology for what you've endured. Sergeant Morrison's behavior was inexcusable, and the fact that it was allowed to continue for so long represents a failure of leadership." Hayes explained that Morrison was facing serious disciplinary action under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. He would likely be demoted in rank, face significant fines, and possibly be discharged from the Army altogether. More importantly for Sarah's immediate situation, Hayes had already spoken with the local district attorney's office. Based on the evidence of Morrison's pattern of harassment and the witness statements from the diner, the DA was prepared to drop the assault charges against Sarah if she was willing to testify about Morrison's behavior in his military disciplinary hearing. Sarah felt a huge weight lift from her shoulders. The possibility of having a criminal record had been keeping her awake at night, and the thought that it might all go away was almost too good to believe. But Lieutenant Colonel Hayes had one more surprise for Sarah. The Army was prepared to provide financial compensation for the harassment she had endured, including covering her lost wages from being suspended and helping with any legal fees she had incurred. When Sarah left Fort Braxton that afternoon, she felt like her life was finally getting back on track. The criminal charges would be dropped, she would receive financial compensation, and Morrison would face real consequences for his actions. However, she still had one major challenge ahead of her: dealing with Tom and getting her job back at the diner. Armed with the news that her charges would be dropped and that the Army was backing her version of events, Sarah felt confident enough to return to Danny's diner to speak with Tom. She had been thinking about this conversation for days, carefully planning what she would say. When Sarah walked into the diner on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, Tom looked surprised and somewhat uncomfortable to see her. The lunch rush had ended, and only a few regular customers were scattered throughout the restaurant. "Sarah," Tom said nervously, "I wasn't expecting to see you. How are you doing?" Sarah had rehearsed this moment, but she still felt her heart racing as she began to speak. "Tom, I need to talk to you about my job. I think you should know that the Army has conducted its own investigation into Morrison's behavior, and they've confirmed everything I told you." Tom's expression shifted from nervousness to confusion. "The Army investigated? What does that have to do with anything?" Sarah explained her meeting with Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, the Army's findings about Morrison's pattern of harassment, and the fact that her criminal charges were being dropped. She watched Tom's face carefully as she spoke, seeing his realization that he had made a serious mistake in how he handled the situation. "Look, Tom," Sarah continued, "I understand that you were in a difficult position, but I've been a good employee here for 2 years. I've never caused problems. I've never been late or called in sick unless it was absolutely necessary, and my customers have always been happy with my service. The only problem I've ever had here was with Morrison, and that wasn't my fault." Tom was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing what Sarah had told him. Finally, he sighed and looked her in the eyes. "Sarah, I owe you an apology. I knew Morrison was giving you trouble, but I was scared of confronting a table full of soldiers. I was worried about losing their business and causing problems with the base. I should have stood up for you, and I didn't. That was wrong." Sarah appreciated the apology, but she needed more than just words. "Tom, I want my job back, and I want you to promise me that if anything like this ever happens again, you'll support your employees instead of worrying about difficult customers." Tom agreed immediately. He reinstated Sarah with back pay for the time she had been suspended, and he also agreed to implement new policies for dealing with harassment in the restaurant. Sarah would return to work the following week, but Sarah's return to the diner wasn't entirely smooth. Word had spread throughout the community about what had happened, and people had strong opinions on both sides. Some customers went out of their way to show Sarah support. Regular customers would specifically request her section and leave extra large tips. Several women told her that they admired her courage and that she had inspired them to stand up for themselves in their own situations. However, not everyone was supportive. A small but vocal group of people felt that Sarah had overreacted and that violence was never acceptable regardless of the circumstances. A few customers refused to sit in her section, and she occasionally overheard whispered comments about being that violent waitress. The situation was particularly difficult with some of the soldiers from Fort Braxton. While many military personnel understood that Morrison had been in the wrong and treated Sarah with respect, others seemed to resent her for getting one of their own in trouble. Sarah learned to handle these challenges with grace and professionalism. When customers made snide comments, she would smile politely and focus on doing her job well. When people tried to provoke arguments about what had happened, she would calmly explain that the matter had been resolved and change the subject. Meanwhile, Morrison's military career was coming to an end. The Army's investigation had revealed multiple incidents of inappropriate behavior toward women, both on and off base. Several female soldiers had come forward with their own complaints about Morrison's conduct, and the pattern of behavior was undeniable. Morrison was court-martialed and found guilty of multiple violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. He was demoted in rank, forced to pay substantial fines, and ultimately discharged from the Army with an other-than-honorable discharge. This type of discharge would make it difficult for him to find employment and would affect his eligibility for veterans' benefits. Sarah heard about Morrison's punishment through Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, who had stayed in touch to keep her informed about the military proceedings. While Sarah felt vindicated that Morrison was facing real consequences, she also felt a complex mix of emotions about the situation. "I never wanted to destroy anyone's life," Sarah confided to her mother one evening. "I just wanted him to leave me alone and treat me with respect. Now his whole career is over." Maria listened thoughtfully before responding. "Mija, you didn't destroy his life. He destroyed his own life with his choices. You just stood up for yourself when no one else would." Sarah's brother Miguel called from his deployment overseas when he heard about what had happened. He was proud of his sister for using the skills he had taught her to defend herself, but he also wanted to make sure she understood the responsibility that came with those skills. "Sarah, what you did was exactly right," Miguel told her during their video call. "That guy left you no choice. But I want you to remember that fighting should always be the last option, when you have no other way to protect yourself. You used your training perfectly, but I hope you never have to use it again." The incident also had a broader impact on the community and Fort Braxton's relationship with local businesses. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes used the situation as an opportunity to address problems that had been brewing for years. Hayes arranged meetings with local business owners to discuss how to better handle situations involving inappropriate behavior by military personnel. She established a direct hotline that civilians could use to report problems with soldiers, ensuring that future incidents would be addressed quickly and appropriately. Several other restaurants and bars near the base implemented new policies for dealing with harassment, inspired by what had happened at Danny's Diner. Staff members were trained on how to recognize signs of harassment and empowered to remove problematic customers regardless of how much money they spent. As months passed, Sarah found that the experience had changed her in unexpected ways. She had always been independent and strong, but defending herself against Morrison had given her a new level of confidence in her ability to handle difficult situations. Sarah's academic performance improved dramatically after the incident was resolved. Without the constant stress and anxiety of dealing with Morrison's harassment, she was able to focus on her nursing studies. Her grades went from barely passing to consistently excellent. She also became more outspoken about issues she cared about. When other students in her classes shared stories about workplace harassment or discrimination, Sarah would speak up with advice and support. She encouraged her classmates to document incidents and report them to appropriate authorities rather than suffering in silence. Sarah's relationship with her family also grew stronger through the experience. Her parents were proud of how she had handled herself, but they also realized they needed to be more aware of the challenges she faced as a young woman working in the service industry. Roberto, Sarah's father, began volunteering with a local organization that provided self-defense training for women. He wanted other fathers to know how important it was to teach their daughters to protect themselves. The compensation Sarah received from the Army allowed her to reduce her work hours at the diner and focus more on her studies. She was able to take additional courses and graduate from her nursing program earlier than originally planned. When Sarah passed her nursing boards and received her license, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes was one of the first people to congratulate her. Hayes had become something of a mentor to Sarah, and their occasional conversations had helped Sarah think about leadership and standing up for what was right. "You've shown incredible strength and maturity throughout this whole situation," Hayes told Sarah. "I hope you'll remember that when you face challenges in your nursing career. Healthcare workers deal with difficult people all the time, and your experience will serve you well." Sarah's first job as a nurse was at a hospital near Fort Braxton, where she worked in the emergency department. Her experience dealing with Morrison had taught her how to remain calm and professional, even when dealing with aggressive or inappropriate patients. Her colleagues quickly noticed Sarah's ability to de-escalate tense situations and her willingness to speak up when she witnessed inappropriate behavior. Within her first year, she was asked to serve on the hospital's Committee for Preventing Workplace Harassment. Tom kept his promise about creating a safer work environment at the diner. He implemented new training for all employees about recognizing and reporting harassment. He also established a clear policy that no customer, regardless of how much money they spent, would be tolerated if they made employees feel unsafe or uncomfortable. The changes at Danny's Diner became a model for other local businesses. Sarah occasionally received thanks from other women who worked in restaurants and bars, telling her that their workplaces had become safer because of the precedent she had set. 2 years after the incident, Sarah was working as a charge nurse in the emergency department when she encountered Morrison again. He had been brought to the hospital after a car accident. Nothing serious, but he needed stitches and observation for a possible concussion. Sarah recognized him immediately, despite the fact that he looked older and more worn down than when she had last seen him. Morrison also recognized her, and for a moment, both of them froze. Sarah's first instinct was to ask another nurse to take over Morrison's care. But then she remembered her professional obligations. She was a nurse now, and her job was to provide care to all patients regardless of their past behavior. She treated Morrison with the same professional courtesy she showed all patients. She was polite, efficient, and focused entirely on his medical needs. Morrison seemed subdued and didn't cause any problems during his treatment. As Sarah was finishing his discharge paperwork, Morrison quietly asked if he could speak with her privately. Sarah agreed, curious about what he might have to say. "I wanted to apologize," Morrison said, looking down at his hands rather than meeting her eyes. "I know it's probably too late and might not mean anything to you, but I needed to say it. My behavior toward you and other women was completely wrong. I was drunk a lot back then, and I thought being a soldier gave me the right to act however I wanted. It didn't." Morrison explained that losing his military career had forced him to take a hard look at his life and his behavior. He had struggled with unemployment, relationship problems, and alcohol abuse after his discharge. He was now working construction and attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Morrison continued. "I just wanted you to know that what happened that night taught me a lesson I should have learned a long time ago. You had every right to defend yourself, and I'm sorry it took getting knocked out for me to realize how wrong I was." Sarah listened to Morrison's apology without interrupting. When he finished speaking, she was quiet for a moment, processing her feelings. "I appreciate you telling me this," Sarah finally said. "I hope you're able to build a better life for yourself. But you're right. This apology should have come years ago before you hurt so many people." Morrison nodded and left the hospital without saying anything else. Sarah never saw him again, but she heard through the community grapevine that he had continued to work construction and had stayed sober. Sarah's experience with Morrison became a story that she would sometimes share with younger women who were dealing with harassment or discrimination. She would tell them about the importance of documenting incidents, seeking support from friends and family, and knowing when to escalate situations to authorities. But she would also emphasize that physical confrontation should always be a last resort, used only when someone is in immediate danger and has no other options. "I was lucky," Sarah would tell these women. "I had training, and I was in a situation where multiple witnesses could verify what had happened. Physical self-defense isn't always the right answer, and it's not always safe. The most important thing is to trust your instincts, seek help when you need it, and never let anyone convince you that harassment is something you just have to accept." 5 years after the incident at Danny's Diner, Sarah was promoted to nurse manager of the emergency department. She had earned a reputation for excellence in patient care and for creating a supportive work environment for her staff. She still lived in the same small town, but now she was seen as a leader and role model rather than just that waitress who punched a soldier. Young women would seek her out for advice, and local organizations would invite her to speak about workplace safety and standing up for yourself. Sarah never forgot the lessons she learned from that difficult period in her life. She understood that standing up for yourself sometimes required courage and risk, but that the alternative, allowing yourself to be mistreated and diminished, was ultimately more damaging. She also learned that real change often comes not from a single dramatic moment, but from the sustained effort to create better systems and policies that protect everyone. The incident with Morrison had been resolved with one punch, but the lasting improvements in workplace safety for women in her community had taken years of advocacy and education. Looking back, Sarah realized that the worst night of her working life at Danny's Diner had ultimately led to positive changes that benefited many people. Morrison's punishment had sent a clear message that harassment would have serious consequences. The policy changes at local businesses had made workplaces safer, and Sarah herself had discovered strengths and capabilities she might never have known she possessed. The experience had taught her that sometimes the most important moments in life are the ones where you have to choose between accepting injustice and taking a stand, even when taking that stand comes with risks and consequences. Sarah was proud that when her moment came, she had chosen to stand up for herself and for what was right.